Okay, we're going to take a quick look now at View's camera depth of field effect. And the first thing we want to do is take a look at our camera here. So we're going to expand our main camera and select the main camera. And if you notice right here, we have our focal, our blur, and focus. Now, blur and focus are the main parts of depth of field effects. And if you take a look, we have this line coming out of our camera here, and then we have sort of a diamond or a square on the end, and that is actually our focus and where the camera is focusing on. Of course, this doesn't affect the scene at all because our blur is set to 0. So let's go ahead and bring a few objects into our scene, and we're just going to add a sphere. We'll go ahead and bring that out about right here, and we'll just add a few other primitives. We'll add a disk, and we'll add a box, and then a pyramid, and just all at different distances from the camera. And then we'll also load in another object. We'll just do a cone close, a lot closer to the camera. So let's go ahead and up that blur on the main camera and see what happens. First I want to actually adjust this. We'll take our focus and we're going to move it down so that what is in focus is our cone. And if we up our blur level, you'll notice in the preview that all the other objects are getting a little out of focus, and then we have our front cone in front in perfect focus. And we can adjust that as much as we wanted to, and keep in mind the preview is going to look terrible. As you can see, it's very distorted, and actually your preview renders, and unless you set your anti-aliasing high, you are going to get very grainy looking renders, but I'm going to show you that in just a sec. So if we can adjust our blur even more if we wanted to, even up to 100%, and you can see that all that's really in focus now is just that front part of the cone, and everything else is extremely blurred. And because of where our focus is, we also have the tip of that cone going out of focus. So what we could also do is adjust our focus so the tip of the cone is actually in focus, and that way we get that sharp point. You also notice here we have these two extra bars that actually came in once we created the blur. And as we bring our blur up higher and lower, if you take a look over here, you can see those bars stretching and changing, and that's all dependent on pretty much what's going to be entirely in focus. And the more we increase the blur, what is the best look as far as crispness goes is going to be within those bars. But of course, it's still really dependent on this little diamond or square we have coming out of the camera. And we could also adjust this focus to any of these objects now. So if we just bring out our focus a little bit farther, out to our cylinder, you notice our cylinder is in focus, our cone in front is extremely out of focus, and everything else is kind of varying in between because our blur is only set to 44. If we crank that up to 100, you notice even more that our cone in front is really out of focus. Our pyramid all the way back is really out of focus, and mainly we just get this nice crispness across our cylinder there. Now, you can also animate these effects. So if I go to Animation Display Timeline, you'll see that we can actually drag this along the timeline. So we'll just go about 5 seconds in, and I'm going to adjust our focus now to go to the cone. And that automatically created a keyframe, because if you right mouse click on the key button right here and you have auto keyframing on, it will automatically create that keyframe for you. And now as we scrub through the animation, you'll see the change in our preview right here of what's in focus and what's not. All these functions are actually can be animated, so we could even change the blur if we wanted to. At this point, we could change our blur all the way down to 0, and it'll start from 100% in the beginning of the animation all the way down to 0 at the end. And what we also have in here is exposure. So if you want to adjust the overall exposure of your scene, you can actually go ahead in just the camera here and crank that up. So if you don't want to do any light changes, or you like the way certain things look, you could just go into this camera and actually change your exposure. We could also make it a little bit darker, but we still get that nice contrast because it's adjusting more of the white balance of the overall scene. Another thing that's also animated is we could adjust the focal, which is pretty much our zoom. So we could change that throughout the scene if we wanted to. And we got a little bit of a change in there. Add an extra keyframe. We could even move that keyframe if we wanted to. So you can get some pretty neat effects. Now, rendering, you have to keep in mind. I'm going to set this exposure back to 0. And I want to, actually, we have to delete. I'm going to destroy the object animation first, because we don't want this to be animated. And since I wasn't on the correct keyframe when I did that, it actually created a new keyframe. But we want to destroy the object's animation. Therefore, no more animation on any of these parameters. Set this exposure back to 0. And still no animation because we're at frame 0. And change the focus back to the cone. Just bring it up just a little. And then our blur we can leave. We'll bring it up a little higher. And our focal length is fine right now. That won't really be a big deal. But we're going to go now up to our render options. So if we go up at the top on this little camera and right mouse click, we'll get our render options. And we have the ability to edit all of the different options for depth of field and things like that. Right now at preview, depth of field really isn't on. If we go to render to screen and select 320 by 240, this way it will pop up in a new window and not just render what's in our frame. And I'm going to set this to user settings. This has gone ahead and checked on depth of field. And with this depth of field, you also have the ability to use either distributed ray tracing or the hybrid 2.5D, which will allow you to set the number of passes that you'd like to do to create that blurring effect, which will give you either a better or worse looking render. We're going to leave it on the distributed ray tracing right now and click OK. And I'm going to go ahead and render this now at 320 by 240 just with all of our default settings, and we're going to take a look and see how that is overall. If you notice, our blurred part of the object or the scene is actually rather grainy, but it does look a heck of a lot better than our preview does. But this is still something you're not going to be wanting using for a final output. Now, keep in mind it does take a long time to render with higher settings, especially with high anti-aliasing settings. And if you're working motion blur into that, that will bring it even higher. But we're going to go ahead now and increase some of our anti-aliasing options and try to get rid of this graininess that we have in here and make our scene look nice and blurred. And we could even use the hybrid 2.5D blurring, and that should also help. So go back to our render options. And for depth of field, we could change this to the hybrid 2.5D. And this also works for any type of blur rendering. It's also for motion blurring. So if we turn on motion blur, and we have that in the scene where we have any objects moving or the camera moving at all, we could enable that motion blur. And I would definitely recommend using motion blur for pretty much any animation because it does add a level of realism in there that you would normally not get without motion blur. But if we take a look now at our anti-aliasing, we have object and texture anti-aliasing on, and that's pretty much their default when we go to our user settings. But we're going to edit our actual anti-aliasing objects. We could turn it on and off if we wanted to, but we're going to, and we also have object and texture. Now technically we don't need texture on because we really don't have a texture on the object. It's just our default color, but chances are you'll be using a actual texture on your object, so we're going to keep that on. But we're going to take a look at our object anti-aliasing overall. We adjust the quality threshold from faster to better, and you notice right here it's all faster and better on the right. So the more we bring it up, the better it's going to look. Bring it down, it's going to render quicker. So this could take, at the highest settings, it could take even up to an hour, even that simple little scene to render at this high. But we're going to go ahead and bring this up to about 60. I'll just go ahead and type those values in. And then click OK. And we're going to render this now with that increased anti-aliasing and see if that affects our scene at all. And go ahead and click render. Okay, now we can see a tiny bit of improvement And most of that improvement is actually just this definition in the front. And that's because we really need to adjust our motion settings for this to kind of get rid of this grain in the back. And although the anti-aliasing did sort of improve it, it still could look a lot better. So we're going to go into that hybrid 2.5 and edit that. So go back to render options, and we're going to go to our edit button within the depth of field and motion blur. We're going to change this to hybrid 2.5D, and we want to bump this up to 10 passes, and click OK. And now we're going to render that and look at the improvement. And this, as you can see already, it's rendering a lot quicker. And what it's actually going to do is render 10 passes and go across the scene 10 times and then compute those together. And of course, the higher amount you choose, the better quality the render is going to be. And we won't notice so much of that graininess in there once this is done, because it's using an entirely different method to calculate our blur. So we'll just wait a sec for this to finish. We can see a very large improvement now in the overall quality of the scene. There is no grain. Everything is very smoothly blurred, and it looks just about perfect. Now, of course, I had set this to 10, and you don't need to set it to 10 to get a good effect. It really depends on your scene. The higher resolution you have, right now we're rendering at 320 by 240, and we could actually probably use a pass of 3 and still get a good effect at this size level. But the higher you go, depending if you're doing film or television, this resolution right here, 320 by 240, is actually half, or approximately half, of television resolution, so it's actually quite small. So you want to kind of adjust those settings for the hybrid, depending on, of course, how large your final render is going to be, because that'll increase your quality overall. Of course, with smaller images, you won't need as high of a setting. Of course, 10 was actually a little high for this, just because it is actually a very small render. So I'm going to go ahead and close this out now, and now I want to show you motion blur. So we're going to create a new scene, just file new, click OK, just using a default sky, and I'm going to select no because we don't want to save that. I'm just going to create a quick and simple animation, nothing too fancy, just enough to show a little bit of motion blur in there. I'm just going to do it just by adding a sphere. I'm going to bring the sphere back, go to animation, display timeline, and we're just going to do, we'll do 3 seconds. Because motion blur is also dependent on speed of an object, or how quickly it is traveling through the scene or across the camera. And after 3 seconds, I want it to move across the camera. I'm going to go in about right there, and if we rendered it right now, we'd notice it's just a perfectly still frame, and there's really no impression of movement. Of course, that's not very realistic, because the human eye only calculates at about 30 frames per second, and typically television frames per second is 30, and film is 24. Now, with the television in certain countries, it could also be 25, depending if it's NTSC or PAL standard. But the human eye does calculate, and there will be a little bit of blur the way you look at it with your eye if you saw this in real life. So therefore, if you want it to look realistic in your animations, you're going to want to add that motion blur. So we're going to go up here and go to our render options. I'm going to select render to screen, and we're going to go back to our user settings. I'm going to increase this just a little to 640 by 480 so you can see it just a little bit better. And I'm going to check off depth of field because we don't need to worry about that. That really doesn't need to be on. And we can actually get rid of a lot of these different things. We don't need blurred transparency or reflection because we don't have those in the scene. So it really depends on what you have in the scene. Same thing with when you're working with materials, trace reflections, trace transparency, you can edit those as well. And there's just a lot you can do with the render options here. And you can set your ray trace level just by dragging up these sliders. But of course, we don't have any reflections in the scene, and we're going to go ahead and show that in a little bit. But we're going to turn on Enable Motion Blurring and go to Edit. And now we could either use the distributed ray tracing, and if I click OK and render that, we're going to notice kind of the same effect that we had before, where it might be a little bit grainy and it won't look exactly perfect. And if you can see around the edge right here, we don't have a whole lot of blur going on, but it's just enough to see that it is very grainy around the edge. You can see little spots here and there. And because of this overall blur, it's actually making the entire object grainy, along with a little bit of its shadow on the bottom. So we're going to change that to our hybrid now. Close that out, open up our rendering options, go to Edit for our blur rendering options, go to the hybrid 2.5D, and we can actually crank that down just a little. We'll go to 5, click OK, and now render that and see the improvement. Now this is definitely a much better render. Of course the blur amount, like I said, isn't very high because our object is not moving very quickly, so we only get a little bit of blur. But if we look around the edge right here, we can see that there is no grain, and on the object itself there is no grain. So the hybrid 2.5D is definitely a great tool for blurred renders. And if you want to kind of show a little more dramatic effect there, I can destroy the object animation, and we're going to go back to frame 0. We're going to go right here, and we're going to create a 1-second animation now, and have this going right across the camera. Now what this will do, actually we might want to even size that down just a bit, or we could even pull it back, so we wouldn't have to do that, just because we don't want it too close to the camera. And right there, that should be good. I'm going to change our render settings, and we're just going to bring it down to 320 by 240, and I'm going to edit our number of passes down to 3. Click OK, and we'll go ahead and render that, and you should be able to see a much more dramatic effect as far as the motion blur. And keep in mind too, when you're rendering, it is going to show all the different passes, and the first pass will always be un-anti-aliased. So you will have very pixelated edges, but this will not affect your output. That's just that first pass that's always un-anti-aliased. And then as you notice, the second pass is coming in, which, as you can see, we already have some smoothing in here, and you can see it traveling upward. We have some nice smoothing. And you can see it a little bit better now. We have more of that blurred edge. But keep in mind too, the more passes that you have, the more motion you will see. Because what it's actually doing is taking, with the passes, it's taking the object's movement, or where it is in the scene, and rendering it at different positions, different intervals for that motion, and then kind of blending them together. So technically we're on frame 17 right now, that you can see down here. But what it's actually kind of doing is rendering frame 16, 17, and 18, and blending them all together with a nice blur. And that's really dependent on the number of passes. And it's not necessarily based on certain keyframes. It might even be 16.5 it renders at. So there's no way to really know entirely, but it is doing passes based on that motion. So actually, if we increase our passes to 20 right now, we might even see a little more motion over here and a little more blurring on the sides. But you can see it's a lot more dramatic effect now because it's going a lot quicker across the camera, and that hybrid does really make a huge difference when it comes to any blurring effects. So if you're going to be doing depth of field or motion blur at all, use the hybrid settings because they will give you an amazing final output as opposed to using just the standard ray tracing options. And now I'm going to go ahead and file new, and just go to new scene, and we're not going to save because I'm going to show you some of those other options we have in the render options, some of the more advanced features. So if we open up our render options here, I'm going to set this back to user settings, and in render quality, we have all these different options we can select. Apply material, enable subrays, and you could just go through and check and uncheck certain things depending on what you're using in the scene. Now, it won't necessarily increase your render times. Let's say if you had blurred reflections checked, to use blurred reflections. If there's no blurred reflections in the scene, it probably won't affect your render time at all. So a lot of the time you can leave these on. And if you have specific preferences you want to use, just use those every time you render, and you want to necessarily have to worry about certain other objects in the scene. Of course, if you do want to check them off, you can, and it might increase your render speed just a tiny bit, because it'll take that into account, that it doesn't need to calculate that at all. But like I said, we can, whether or not we want to cast shadows. So we can show you that really quick. And we take a look at the scene, and we can see that we have a shadow in the preview. And if we go ahead and set this to render to screen 320 by 240 and go ahead and render that. We can see our shadow, of course. I'm going to go ahead now and go back to our user settings, and if we turn off trace cast shadows, click OK, we can render. We'll see that there are no shadows in the scene. So we can really define whether or not we want to have shadows. It might even increase our render speeds. For that other one, went a lot quicker just because we were in preview mode. But if you just want to do an animatic or just a quick render preview, if you want to preview an animation, just look at the actual animation, not exactly the overall output. You can go ahead and click off shadows, turn off reflections, turn off refraction, and anything you really don't need if you just want to define or take a look at the animation or the overall before you do the final render. And if you're just trying to do a quick animation too, you could also go ahead and turn off the anti-aliasing. But the preview mode is pretty much really good for a lot of that. But as you notice too, our cast shadows is on, and reflections is on, transparency is on. So if you want to go a little more in depth, you can just go to your user setting and you can check those off. Anything you might not need, and just to get kind of the overall effect of your animation that you're previewing. So if you don't really want any anti-aliasing on or anything like that, you can just go ahead and check those off. Or if you want to have them on, you can set them to lower levels. We have ours set rather high right now. We could set those down to 4, or make our quality threshold a little bit faster, and you can just move all these sliders to a little bit faster, and that way you can get a nice preview render of your scene. You could also uncheck motion blurring, because that does take a lot longer to render when you have that on, and whether or not you want to optimize the volumetric lights. And when you're actually in a scene then for the final render, you could even go in and what we have right here is these edit buttons, and you can see before we had the edit button for the depth of field and enable motion blurring, and we have this gray bar connecting them, showing that they are linked to this edit button. Well, we have the same thing up here for trace reflections and transparency. And also notice too, once we check these on and off, we also have the ability to have blurred reflections and blurred transparency. But I'm going to check this edit button, and we're going to go back, and we can see that we have a faster level of trace, and then also down here, whether or not it's faster or larger for the max total internal reflection level. Now what this pretty much does is the more we increase it, the better our reflections are going to look, and the more it's going to reflect into the scene. So technically, if you have two mirrors, one in front of you, one behind, you'll see yourself infinitely. Well, you can actually adjust that infinite amount by choosing faster or better. The better amount will, of course, allow you to view more reflections more infinitely than you would normally. But you don't always need that infinite reflection, which can take a long time to render. So you can just turn those down a little bit lower if you just need a little bit of reflection back and forth between the two objects, and if your quality doesn't necessarily need to be huge. There's another setting in here too, actually tile rendering. And depending on if you're coming from a different software animation program, if you used to Lightwave, then actually tile rendering is kind of what you'll be used to. Let's go ahead and just do a quick render right now without tile rendering on and see what happens. It's rendering our scene, going upwards from the bottom of the frame, and we are getting our final output with each one of these segments that is rendered. Now let's go back and do tile rendering and click render. We're going to notice sort of the same effect that we get with our preview render, where it's going and re-evaluating and adding the anti-aliasing throughout the scene. And you might notice a little bit of a render change. As you can see right here, we had 12 seconds. So if you close that, turn off tile rendering, and render that normally, we'll take a look at the overall time that it takes to render. And you can see that was 11 seconds. So actually the tile rendering was longer than the regular rendering. So it really depends on what you want out of the scene. You might get a better quality from tile rendering, depending on how complex the scene is or whether or not you need it to look a little bit better. That might even reduce a lot of your graininess that you get in certain parts of scenes, because a lot of the time you kind of have grainy renders, especially at higher resolutions. So that could also fix that, because it's revaluing a little bit more and it's going a little more in depth, and it really depends on, like I said, your preferences and whatever render speed you have the ability to have time to calculate. So that's some of our render options and camera features and things like that. And go ahead and use those in your scene. Depth of field is always a great effect, and so is motion blur. Like I said, if you have any animation whatsoever, you're going to be wanting using motion blur. And there was just one last thing I wanted to cover really quick too. If you're working with television and you have motion in the scene where you have an object traveling from one side of the screen to the other, or pretty much just television in general, if you want to render directly to that and you want to reduce the flickering, which usually can happen since television is a little bit different than working with film because you are working with 60 fields per second. It's 30 frames per second, but it's actually 60 fields, and there's an A field and a B field per each frame. So it's technically 60 frames per second. And what we can take a look here is go to Animation and Render Animation. And this will bring up our animation render options. And if we go to Advanced Animation Options, we can select whether or not we want to use field interlacing, and whether or not it's even or odd, and that really depends on what your output is going to be. But you want to make sure you have field interlacing on if you are going to be rendering for any sort of television, whether it be NTSC or PAL, because it does use interlaced frames to display television. If you're going to be doing DVD and it has progressive scan, then you don't really have to worry about that too much, because that won't really be a big deal.